The frost hadn't lifted yet when Ruth Calloway walked the fence line, dragging a bundle of broken branches behind her like a sled. Her boots cracked through the thin ice on the puddles, her breath hung in the air. And behind her, from the porch of the Hensley place, came the laughter. "There she goes again," someone muttered, "collecting firewood nobody wants." Except it wasn't firewood. She never burned a single piece of it. For 3 months, Ruth had been walking from farm to farm in the valley, asking permission to haul away what everyone else considered trash. Storm-broken limbs, rotting deadfall, the tangled brush nobody had time to clear. She never explained why. She just asked, loaded her cart, and left. By the time the ice thawed that spring, half the valley thought the widow on the old Calloway place had finally lost her mind. What none of them knew was that she'd already lost the thing that mattered more, and she wasn't about to lose the land too. If stories about quiet determination and people who see value where everyone else sees waste keep you watching until the very end, stay with us. We'd love to hear where in the world you're watching from. Ruth's husband, Walter, had died 18 months earlier. In the same month, the well ran dry. The two losses arrived so close together that for a long while she couldn't separate her grief from the cracked, dust-colored dirt spreading across their 11 acres. Walter had always managed the land. Ruth had managed the house, the ledgers, the long silences he never filled. When he was gone, both jobs fell to her, and neither one waited politely for her to catch her breath. The soil on the Calloway place had never been generous. Thin topsoil sat over a bed of clay that turned to concrete every August. 2 dry summers before that had already thinned out the young trees Walter once planted, and the bank had sent a letter reminding her, gently but clearly, that patience had a limit. She could have sold. Everyone assumed she would. Instead, she started walking. Every morning before the frost burned off, she'd load the cart and go door to door, asking the same question in the same steady voice. Most people said yes without thinking twice. It cost them nothing to let a widow haul away their trash. A few said no, unsettled by a woman who wanted their garbage and wouldn't say why. She thanked them just the same and moved on to the next fence line. By midwinter, her hands had gone rough and split at the knuckles from the cold wood. Her shoulders ached in a way that had nothing to do with grief anymore. But the cart kept filling, load after load, farm after farm. At the Pruitt farm, old Sam Pruitt watched her load broken branches onto a borrowed handcart and shook his head. "Ma'am, if you're needing wood, I got a stack of good split logs right there." "I don't need logs," Ruth said. "I need the broken pieces, the ones already coming apart." Sam didn't understand it. Neither did his wife, who told half the church congregation about the widow hauling garbage from other people's yards like it was treasure. But Ruth kept notes, small ones, in a notebook with a cracked leather spine that had been Walter's. She wrote down where snow melted first on her land each morning, where the ground stayed damp 3 days after a light rain, and where it turned to dust by noon, where the wind cut hardest across the open rows. She was reading her land the way another woman might read a letter, slowly and more than once. By April, she had 6 low mounds running along the eastern edge of her property, each one built from layers of the branches she'd gathered, packed with old leaves, and finally covered in a thick blanket of soil. From a distance, they looked like long, low graves. "She's burying something out there," Sam's wife said. "I don't want to know what." Nobody asked Ruth directly. And Ruth, true to form, didn't offer an explanation. She just kept building. What she was actually building had a name, though it wasn't one anyone in the valley had heard before. Walter's father, decades earlier, had once mentioned an old method to her, burying rotting wood beneath garden beds to hold water through a dry season. She hadn't thought of it in years. Grief has a strange way of returning old conversations to you exactly when you need them. The idea was simple enough to explain in a sentence, even if no one in the valley had tried it. Buried wood soaks up water like a sponge during rain, then slowly releases it back into the soil during drought. As the wood breaks down, it feeds the roots above it for years. It doesn't need a well. It doesn't need a miracle. It only needs time and enough branches to fill the ground with something worth waiting on. Ruth didn't have money for irrigation. She had a cart, 2 working hands, and every fallen branch her neighbors were happy to be rid of. The first mound failed within a month. A hard spring rain tore straight through the loose soil covering it, washing half her work into the ditch along the road. She stood in the downpour, looking at the ruined mound. And for the first time since Walter's funeral, she let herself sit down in the mud and simply not move for a while. Then she got up, and she rebuilt it, angled against the slope this time, so the water would slow down instead of racing through. That wasn't the last setback. A windstorm in May tore the covering off a second mound, exposing the branches underneath like ribs. Ruth spent 2 days repacking it, her hands raw from the work. A few weeks after that, deer stripped the tender cover crop off a third mound down to bare dirt, forcing her to fence it with the very deadfall she hadn't yet buried, brush piled high enough to keep hooves out. Each time, she rebuilt. Each time, a little more of the valley watched her do it and said nothing, because there was nothing about it that looked like it was working. One afternoon, a traveling agricultural supplier stopped by to sell her seed and caught sight of the mounds instead. He walked the length of them without a word, then asked if she'd learned the method from a book. She told him no, from an old man's memory, passed down and nearly lost. He didn't laugh. He simply nodded, said he'd seen something like it once in another county, years back, on a farm that had weathered a drought nobody else survived. It was the first time anyone outside her own head had told her she wasn't imagining the whole thing. That same spring, once the mounds finally held, she planted young apple whips directly into them, bare, leafless sticks that didn't look like they'd survive the week, let alone a season. Around them she scattered a cover crop, something to hold the loosened soil together while the new roots found their footing. By June, the cover crop had greened in low around the base of each whip. The trees themselves were still thin, still unconvincing. It wasn't much to look at. To anyone passing by, it was dirt with weeds and sticks on it. But underneath, something was happening that no one could see. That first summer passed without event. The whips held their leaves, grew an inch or two, and did nothing remarkable. Ruth kept her notebook. She watched the trees the way she once watched Walter sleep in his final months, carefully and without saying so out loud, for any sign of what was coming. It was the second summer that tested them. The heat that July was the worst the valley had recorded in a decade. Wells across the county dropped low enough that 2 neighboring farms lost entire fields of corn. By every reasonable expectation, Ruth's young trees, barely a year in the ground, with the shallowest roots of anyone's orchard for miles, should have died first. They didn't die. It was Sam Pruitt who noticed, driving past on his way to check his own failing crop. He pulled his truck over, walked out into her field without asking, and crouched down at the base of one of her trees. The leaves were curled slightly from the heat, but they were green. Everywhere else in the valley that summer, green had become rare. "How?" he said, not quite a question. Ruth straightened up, wiping dirt from her hands. "The branches," she said. "They're not garbage in the ground. They're water, waiting." He didn't fully understand it that day, but he came back the next week, and the week after that, and eventually he stopped pretending he was just passing by. Word moves slowly in a small valley, and slower still when pride is involved. It took most of that summer for people to stop calling her strange and start calling her lucky. As if luck could explain a barely established orchard outlasting a drought that had already gutted farms twice its age. It wasn't luck. It was one hard winter of gathering, 3 ruined mounds rebuilt by hand, and a willingness to be laughed at for as long as it took to be right. By the following spring, the older trees Walter had planted years before, the ones everyone assumed were finished, began to bud again alongside the young ones from the mounds. The orchard didn't explode into life overnight. It arrived the way real things do, slowly, one blossom at a time, until one morning in late April, the entire eastern slope of the Callaway farm was white with flowers, visible from the road all the way past the Hensley place where the laughter had started. Nobody was laughing there anymore. People came at first out of curiosity. Then they came with questions. Then, eventually, they came with their own carts, asking if she still needed branches, or if she'd be willing to show them how to build a mound of their own. She said yes to all of it. That first harvest, the road along the Callaway place, filled with trucks in a way it never had before. Crates stacked on tailgates, the smell of ripe apples thick enough to reach the porch, of the Hensley place itself. Children who'd once been told to stay away from the strange widow's field ran through the rows instead, filling baskets, sticky-handed and laughing for reasons that had nothing to do with mockery anymore. There was no lecture in how Ruth taught. She simply walked people along her rows the way she once walked alone, showing them where the water pooled, where the wind cut hardest, where the ground remembered rain longer than it should. Sam Pruitt built 3 mounds of his own that year. His wife, the same woman who'd once whispered about the widow burying something suspicious in her field, brought over jars of preserves and stayed to help stack branches. The bank never sent another letter. It didn't need to. By the second full harvest, the Callaway orchard was shipping crates of apples to towns Ruth had never visited, grown on trees that had outlasted a drought most of the valley still talked about with a shudder. What people remembered in the years after wasn't really the orchard. Orchards come and go with enough rain and enough luck. What they remembered was a woman who had every reason to give up, and instead spent a whole winter gathering what everyone else had thrown away, then years waiting for it to matter. She never once said, "I told you so." She didn't need to. The trees said it for her, every spring, in a language nobody in the valley had thought to listen for until she taught them how. Somewhere underneath all that blossom and fruit, buried deep where no one could see it, were the same broken branches people had laughed at her for collecting, quietly rotting, quietly feeding the roots above, doing exactly what she always knew they would. It turns out the difference between waste and worth was never in the branches at all. It was in who was patient enough to wait for what they'd become.